The Forgotten on Vega 12. The twin suns of Vega 12 cast their harsh rays over the colony, their intense light making the metallic structures shimmer like molten silver. Life on this alien world was unforgiving, not just for the land but also for its people. Here, perfection wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Only the fittest, strongest, and most capable had a place in the colony. Those who couldn't meet these standards were cast aside like broken tools. Lyra had learned this the hard way. Once a promising student with a sharp mind and an eye for innovation, her world came crashing down when a mysterious illness paralyzed her legs. Overnight, her future vanished, replaced by whispered pity and cold stares. Her family, once proud of her achievements, began to see her as a burden. They tried to care for her at first, but resources were scarce, and compassion ran dry quickly. One day, they took her to the outskirts of the colony, left her with a bag of rations, and walked away without looking back. That was 3 weeks ago. Lyra now lived in the shadow of the colony's towering walls, where the air smelled of rust and decay. She had built a crude shelter from discarded materials scavenged from the junkyard. The nights were the worst. The cold seeped into her bones, and the sounds of distant predators reminded her that she was not safe. Her rations were almost gone, and her body was growing weaker. She sat outside her shelter, staring at the horizon. The landscape of Vega 12 was both beautiful and terrifying, a mix of jagged rocks and alien flora that glowed faintly in the twilight. She could see the colony lights in the distance, a reminder of the life she had been forced to leave behind. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low guttural growl. Her heart raced as she turned toward the sound. Emerging from the shadows was a creature she had only seen in cautionary broadcasts, a Skrillex. The beast stood on 4 muscular legs, its body covered in scales that shimmered like oil. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto her, and it bared its razor-sharp teeth. Lyra froze. She had no weapons, no way to defend herself. Her mind raced, trying to remember the survival tips she had read as a child, but panic clouded her thoughts. The Skrillex crouched, preparing to pounce. Then, a sharp whistle pierced the air. The Skrillex hesitated, its head snapping toward the source of the sound. Lyra turned as well, and saw a figure emerging from the shadows, a man wearing a patched utility suit and carrying a metal rod that sparked with electricity. "Get back," the man shouted, waving the rod. The Skrillex growled but took a cautious step back. The man pressed a button on his wristband, and a high-pitched frequency filled the air. The creature howled and flowed into the darkness. Lyra let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with a mix of fear and relief. The man approached cautiously, lowering his weapon. He was in his early 30s, with messy brown hair and a face marked by soot and scars. His piercing blue eyes studied her with concern. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Lyra nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was. Who are you?" "Name's Ethan," he replied, kneeling beside her. "I work in the junkyard. Saw you here a few days ago. Figured you might need help." Lyra narrowed her eyes. "Why would you care?" Ethan shrugged. "Why not? I've been where you are. People here, they don't have much room for kindness." She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need pity, but the truth was, she did need help. Her stomach growled, betraying her hunger. Ethan noticed and pulled a ration bar from his pack, handing it to her. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but it'll keep you going." Lyra hesitated before taking it. She unwrapped the bar and took a small bite. It was stale and tasteless, but to her, it was a feast. Ethan sat on the ground beside her, looking out at the horizon. "This place is tough," he said. "It chews people up and spits them out, but you don't have to face it alone." She glanced at him, unsure whether to trust him. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said simply. "Just thought you could use a friend." The word friend felt foreign to Lyra. She had been alone for so long, abandoned by everyone she thought cared about her. Was it possible that someone could help her without expecting anything in return? Before she could respond, a distant rumble echoed through the air. Ethan stood, scanning the horizon. "Patrol drones," he muttered. "They're looking for people like us. We need to move." "Move where?" Lyra asked, her voice rising in panic. "I've got a place," Ethan said, extending his hand to her. "It's not much, but it's safe. Trust me." Lyra hesitated, staring at his outstretched hand. This man was a stranger, but he had risked his life to save hers. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Ethan smiled. "Let's go." As he helped her into a makeshift transport, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as forgotten as she thought. A risky alliance. Ethan's workshop was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. Hidden deep within the sprawling junkyard, it was a chaotic but functional space, cobbled together from scrap and discarded colony tech. The walls were reinforced with sheets of salvaged metal, and dim lights hung from wires strung haphazardly across the ceiling. Shelves were crammed with tools, spare parts, and half-finished projects, giving the place an air of both ingenuity and desperation. Lyra sat on an old dented hover crate, watching as Ethan moved around the room with practiced ease. His hands were quick and precise as he tinkered with a small device that hummed softly on the workbench. He hadn't said much since they arrived, and Lyra wasn't sure how to break the silence. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Why are you doing this?" "Helping me, I mean." Ethan glanced up, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his work goggles. "I told you. I've been where you are." "That's not an answer," Lyra pressed. "You don't even know me." Ethan sighed, setting down the device and pulling off his goggles. "You're right. I don't. But I know what it feels like to be left behind. To be told you're not good enough." His voice softened. "And I know what it's like to wish someone had cared enough to help." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "And what did that get you?" "This?" She gestured to the workshop, its cluttered state barely hiding the struggles of its owner. Ethan chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Yeah, this isn't exactly the dream. But it's mine. I've survived out here longer than anyone expected because I didn't give up. And neither should you." Lyra wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't giving up. She'd just been dealt a bad hand. But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. The weight of her circumstances had been crushing her spirit, and a part of her had started to believe the colony was right to cast her aside. Ethan leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. "You've got a sharp mind. I can tell. And out here, brains count for a lot more than legs. You can either sit there and wait for the end, or you can fight back. Your call." Lyra stared at him, her thoughts swirling. Could she really fight back? Could she carve out a life for herself in a place that had already discarded her? She didn't know. But as she looked around the workshop, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Possibility. "What are you working on?" she asked, changing the subject. Ethan's face lit up slightly, and he turned back to the workbench. "This." He held up the device, which resembled a mechanical glove with exposed wiring. "It's part of an exoskeleton I've been building. Designed to help with heavy lifting, but it could do a lot more if I can get it working." Lyra's curiosity piqued. "What's wrong with it?" "Power source," Ethan said with a shrug. "The colony's energy cores are proprietary tech, and scavenging them isn't easy. I've been trying to build a compatible battery, but..." He gestured to the pile of failed prototypes on the floor. Lyra picked up one of the discarded batteries, turning it over in her hands. Despite her situation, she couldn't help but analyze its design. "Your circuit alignment is off," she said matter-of-factly. "The energy output would short-circuit the system." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You know a thing or two about tech." "I was studying to be an engineer before." She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the memories. "Well, Engineer Lyra," Ethan said with a grin, "you just earned yourself a spot on the team. Welcome aboard." Lyra rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had something to contribute. The moment was interrupted by a loud beeping from a console in the corner. Ethan's expression darkened as he hurried over to check the screen. "What is it?" Lyra asked, her pulse quickening. "Colony patrols," Ethan muttered. "They've increased their sweeps. Probably looking for people like us." "People like us," Lyra repeated, frowning. "Anyone they consider a threat to their perfect little society," Ethan said bitterly. "Outcasts, scavengers, anyone who doesn't fit their mold. They don't tolerate loose ends." The beeping grew louder, and Ethan cursed under his breath. "They're close. We need to power down and go dark." He began shutting off equipment, and Lyra helped as best she could. The lights dimmed, and the hum of machinery faded until the workshop was eerily silent. They crouched in the shadows, listening to the faint whine of patrol drones overhead. Lyra's heart pounded as the sound grew louder, then began to fade. She exhaled shakily, but Ethan remained tense. "They're still in the area," he said. "We'll have to stay low for a while." "Is it always like this?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pretty much," Ethan replied. "But you get used to it." Lyra doubted that. She wasn't sure she wanted to get used to living like this, but as she looked at Ethan, she realized he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting back. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to do the same. Escape plans. The dim light of Ethan's workshop flickered as Lyra stared at the crude blueprint spread across the workbench. The design for the exoskeleton was ambitious, but incomplete, an amalgamation of salvaged tech and raw ingenuity. Ethan stood beside her, his hands on his hips as he studied the plans with a furrowed brow. "It could work," Lyra said, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. "But you're right. Without a proper power source, it's just dead weight." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's only one place on Vega 12 where we might find what we need, but it's not exactly friendly territory." "Where?" Lyra asked, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. "The alien wilderness," Ethan replied grimly. "Past the colony borders, deep into the unexplored zones. There are energy cells there, left over from the first terraforming missions. They're old but still potent. The problem is, the wilderness is crawling with predators, and the colony patrols don't like anyone going off-grid." Lyra leaned back in her chair, the weight of his words sinking in. "You're saying we'd have to risk our lives just to get this thing running?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression serious. "It's not just about the exoskeleton, Lyra. It's about survival. Out here, we can't afford to play it safe. If we don't fight for what we need, no one else will." Lyra bit her lip, torn between fear and determination. She had already lost so much. Her family, her future, her independence. But Ethan's words struck a chord. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "What's the plan?" she asked finally. Ethan's face softened with a small smile. "You're in." She nodded. "I don't see any other choice." The next morning, they prepared for the journey. Ethan handed Lyra a compact pulse pistol, its barrel scratched and worn but functional. She stared at it uneasily. "I've never used one of these," she admitted. "Then it's a good time to learn," Ethan said, showing her how to grip the weapon and toggle its settings. "It's not about aiming perfectly. Just point and shoot if something gets too close." Lyra practiced a few times, her hands trembling slightly. It felt unnatural, holding a weapon. But the memory of the Skrillex's glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth reminded her of the necessity. Ethan packed a small hover sled with supplies, tools, rations, and a scanning device to locate the energy cells. As they stepped out of the workshop and into the junkyard, the twin suns of Vega 12 bathed the landscape in harsh light. The colony walls loomed in the distance, a stark reminder of the world they had been cast out from. "We'll take the back route," Ethan said, pointing to a narrow path that led away from the junkyard and toward the wilderness. less chance of running into patrols. Lyra followed him, her wheelchair replaced with a makeshift exoskeleton frame that provided basic mobility. It wasn't the full suit Ethan envisioned, but it allowed her to walk short distances with his help. The wilderness was a stark contrast to the orderly chaos of the colony. The terrain was jagged and uneven, covered in strange, bioluminescent flora that pulsed faintly in the shadows. Alien creatures darted between the rocks, their glowing eyes watching the intruders with curiosity and hunger. "Stick close to me," Ethan said, his voice low, "and keep that pistol ready." Lyra nodded, gripping the weapon tightly. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or distant growl, set her nerves on edge. But she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. They had a mission, and failure wasn't an option. Hours passed as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The scanner beeped faintly, guiding them toward the energy cells. Ethan kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, his hand never straying far from the pulse rifle slung over his shoulder. "Almost there," he said finally, his voice breaking the tense silence. "The cells should be in a cave up ahead." Lyra squinted at the rocky outcrop in the distance. The entrance to the cave was partially hidden by a thicket of alien vines that glowed faintly in the dim light. It looked like something out of a nightmare, but it was their only hope. As they approached the cave, a low growl stopped them in their tracks. Ethan held up a hand, signaling for Lyra to stay quiet. From the shadows emerged a massive creature, its body covered in thick, spiked scales. Its eyes glowed with an eerie green light, and its claws dug into the ground as it stared them down. "A cave guardian," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Figures. What do we do?" Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "We don't have time to fight it," Ethan said, his mind racing. "We'll have to distract it and make a run for the cells." Lyra's heart pounded as Ethan handed her the scanner. "You go for the cells. I'll keep it busy." "Are you insane?" she hissed. "You'll get yourself killed." Ethan grinned. "Not if I'm fast enough. Just trust me, okay?" Before she could protest, Ethan stepped forward, raising his pulse rifle and firing a shot into the air. The creature roared and charged toward him, its massive frame shaking the ground with every step. "Go," Ethan shouted, dodging to the side as the beast swiped at him. Lyra hesitated for a split second before running toward the cave, the scanner beeping more rapidly as she neared the energy cells. Inside, the cave was dark and damp, the air heavy with the scent of moss and minerals. The cells were tucked into a crevice near the back, glowing faintly with a blue light. She grabbed them quickly, her hands shaking. As she turned to leave, the sound of the creature's roars and Ethan's shouts echoed from outside. "Please be okay," she whispered, clutching the cells tightly as she ran back toward the entrance. When she emerged, she saw Ethan scrambling to his feet, blood dripping from a shallow gash on his arm. The creature was still roaring, but Ethan had managed to lure it away from the cave. "Got them," Lyra shouted, holding up the cells. Ethan grinned despite his injuries. "Then let's get the hell out of here." Together, they sprinted back toward the wilderness, the sound of the creature's angry roars fading behind them. It wasn't until they were a safe distance away that they allowed themselves to breathe. "We did it," Lyra said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and relief. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, we did." For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Into the wilds. The wilderness of Vega 12 was unlike anything Lyra had ever imagined. It was alive with an eerie vibrancy, bioluminescent plants that pulsed like heartbeat veins, jagged crystalline formations that hummed faintly in the wind, and creatures that darted through the shadows, their movements too fast to track. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and the ground felt spongy beneath their boots. Every step forward felt like venturing into a living, breathing organism. Ethan led the way, his pulse rifle slung across his back and a handheld scanner in his grip. Lyra followed close behind, her makeshift exoskeleton clicking softly with each step. The device was heavy and unwieldy, but it gave her the mobility she had sorely missed. She tried not to think about how fragile it felt in comparison to the hostile environment around her. "We'll need to move fast," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "The patrols won't come this far out, but the wildlife here doesn't care about keeping its distance." Lyra nodded, gripping the pistol Ethan had given her. She had never thought she'd need to carry a weapon, let alone in a place like this, but the memory of the Skrillex's snarling face was enough to keep her fingers tight around the handle. As they pressed deeper into the wilderness, Lyra couldn't help but notice how Ethan seemed to move with practiced ease. He navigated the uneven terrain with precision, pausing every so often to check their surroundings or consult his scanner. It was clear he had done this before, though his focus remained unshakable. "How many times have you been out here?" she asked, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "More than I'd like to admit. It's not exactly my idea of a good time, but it's where the good salvage is. Most people are too scared to come out here, which means less competition." "Lucky me," Lyra muttered, adjusting the straps on her exoskeleton. "I get to be your backup." Ethan chuckled. "You're doing fine. Besides, it's not just about surviving out here. It's about learning how to think on your feet. That's what keeps you alive." Lyra wasn't sure if she found that comforting or terrifying. Either way, she followed Ethan as he led them toward the base of a rocky hill. The scanner in his hand began to beep faintly, signaling they were getting closer to their target. "Energy cells are just ahead," Ethan said, nodding toward a cluster of glowing crystal formations at the top of the hill. "They're embedded in those rocks. We'll have to extract them carefully." "Carefully," Lyra echoed, glancing nervously at the alien landscape around them. The air felt heavier here, charged with a strange energy that made her skin prickle. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ethan noticed her hesitation and stopped, turning to face her. "Hey," he said softly, his tone reassuring. "We've got this. Stick close to me, and we'll be fine." Lyra nodded, swallowing her fear. Together, they climbed the hill, the rocky terrain growing steeper with each step. When they reached the top, Ethan pulled out a small cutting tool and began working on the crystals. Lyra kept watch, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. The wilderness was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint hum of the crystals and the occasional hiss of Ethan's tool. Lyra's grip on her pistol tightened as her eyes darted from shadow to shadow. And then she saw it. A pair of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, followed by the hulking form of an alien predator. Its body was covered in sleek black fur that shimmered like liquid metal, and its claws glinted under the faint light of the crystals. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its gaze locked on Lyra. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't look up. "Almost done." "Ethan," she repeated, louder this time. The urgency in her voice made him glance over his shoulder, and his eyes widened when he saw the creature. "Keep it distracted," he said quickly, his hands moving faster. "I just need a few more seconds." "Distracted? How?" Lyra hissed, panic rising in her chest. The creature took a step closer, its growl deepening. She raised the pistol, her hands shaking as she aimed at the creature's head. The first shot went wide, missing the creature entirely. It snarled, its muscles tensing as it prepared to pounce. Lyra fired again, this time hitting it in the shoulder. The creature let out a deafening roar, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it lunged toward her, its claws slicing through the air. Lyra stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding its attack. Her heart pounded as she fired another shot, this one grazing its side. The creature hesitated for a moment, giving her a precious second to scramble to her feet. "Lyra, move," Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He had finished extracting the cells, and was now holding them securely in a small containment unit. Lyra didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, her exoskeleton whirring loudly as it struggled to keep up with her frantic pace. Ethan followed close behind, the energy cells tucked under one arm and his pulse rifle in the other. The creature gave chase, its guttural growls growing louder as it closed the distance. Ethan fired a few shots over his shoulder, but the beast was relentless. "Down here," Ethan called, leading them toward a narrow crevice between two massive rocks. They slid into the gap just as the creature reached them, its claws raking against the stone with a piercing screech. Breathing heavily, Lyra and Ethan pressed themselves against the rock wall, the sound of the creature's frustrated roars echoing around them. After a few tense moments, the noise faded, and the wilderness fell silent once more. Ethan turned to Lyra, a wry grin on his face. "Well, that was fun." Lyra glared at him, her chest still heaving. "If that's your idea of fun, I don't want to know what you consider boring." Ethan laughed, his relief palpable. "Come on, let's get back to the workshop. We've got what we came for." As they emerged from the crevice and began the long journey back, Lyra couldn't help but feel a strange sense of accomplishment. For the first time since her abandonment, she had faced the wilderness and survived. And though the journey was far from over, she felt a flicker of hope growing inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than she thought. The turning point. By the time Ethan and Lyra stumbled back into the workshop, the twin sons of Vega 12 had begun their descent, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. Both were exhausted, their clothes torn and their bodies bruised from the journey. Ethan placed the containment unit with the energy cells on the workbench and collapsed onto a nearby stool, his pulse rifle clattering to the floor. Lyra, still shaking from the encounter with the predator, leaned against the wall, letting the makeshift exoskeleton support her weight. She watched Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "We survived," she said softly, the words almost foreign to her after the chaos of the day. Ethan looked up, a weary grin spreading across his face. "Told you we could do it." "Barely," Lyra muttered, lowering herself onto a crate. Her hands trembled as she took a swig from the water bottle Ethan handed her. "That thing, it was faster than anything I've ever seen." "Welcome to the wilderness," Ethan said, leaning back and closing his eyes. "The colony might be cold, but out there, that's a whole different kind of cruel." Lyra stared at the energy cells glowing faintly in their container. "Are they worth it?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Ethan opened his eyes and leaned forward, his expression serious. "Absolutely. These cells are the key to making the exoskeleton work. With them, we can finish the suit, and you'll have more than just mobility. You'll have a second chance." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Lyra felt a spark of hope. But it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of the day's events, and what happens after that. "The colony isn't going to suddenly welcome me back." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who cares about the colony? They don't define your worth. You don't need their approval to survive, only your own determination." Lyra fell silent, unsure how to respond. She had spent so long defining herself by the colony's standards that imagining a life outside of them felt impossible. But Ethan's confidence was infectious, and a small part of her wanted to believe he was right. The next morning, Ethan set to work integrating the energy cells into the exoskeleton. Lyra watched as he carefully connected wires, calibrated circuits, and adjusted the suit's joints. Despite his rough exterior, Ethan's hands moved with the precision of a master craftsman. "This is going to work," he said, more to himself than to Lyra. "It has to." Lyra, eager to help, studied the blueprints and pointed out potential inefficiencies. Though she lacked Ethan's hands-on experience, her theoretical knowledge proved invaluable. Together, they made rapid progress. As the hours passed, Lyra began to feel a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. The exoskeleton was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of defiance against the world that had abandoned her. For the first time, she saw a future that wasn't defined by her disability or the colony's rejection. By nightfall, the exoskeleton was complete. The suit stood in the center of the workshop, a sleek and imposing frame of metal and circuitry. It was both functional and elegant, designed to amplify strength and agility, while providing mobility to those who couldn't walk. "It's beautiful," Lyra said, her voice filled with awe. Ethan chuckled. "It's functional. Beauty's a bonus." He gestured for her to step forward. "It's all yours." Lyra hesitated, her heart pounding. The exoskeleton represented everything she had been striving for, a chance to reclaim her independence. But it also carried the weight of her fears. What if it didn't work? What if she wasn't strong enough to use it? Sensing her hesitation, Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this. Trust me." Taking a deep breath, Lyra stepped into the suit. Ethan guided her as she slid her legs into the mechanical braces and secured the harness around her torso. The suit's interior hummed softly as the energy cells powered up, and a faint glow emanated from the circuits. "Okay," Ethan said, stepping back. "Try moving." Lyra hesitated for a moment before shifting her weight. The suit responded instantly, its servos whirring as it mimicked her movements. She took a tentative step forward, then another, her movements growing more confident with each stride. "It works," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It really works." Ethan grinned, clapping his hands together. "I told you it would." Lyra turned to face him, a smile breaking across her face. For the first time in months, she felt strong, capable. The suit didn't just give her the ability to walk, it gave her hope. But their celebration was short-lived. A loud crash echoed through the workshop as the door was blown off its hinges. Lyra and Ethan spun around to see a group of heavily armed men storming in, their weapons trained on the pair. At the front of the group stood a man Lyra didn't recognize, but Ethan's face darkened with anger. "Victor," he spat. A man smirked, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the workshop. "Hello, Ethan. Still playing with scraps, I see. What do you want?" Ethan demanded, stepping protectively in front of Lyra. Victor's smirk widened. "Oh, just a little insurance. You've been hoarding some valuable tech out here, and I'm here to collect." Lyra's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The exoskeleton wasn't just a lifeline for her. It was a threat to the colony's rigid hierarchy. And Victor was here to make sure it never saw the light of day. Ethan clenched his fists, his body tense. "You're not taking anything." Victor raised an eyebrow. "I think you'll find you don't have a choice." The armed men stepped forward, their weapons gleaming under the workshop's lights. Lyra's grip tightened on the exoskeleton's controls. She wasn't going to let them take everything she had fought for. Not without a fight. Betrayal and revelation. The cold air of the workshop hung heavy as Lyra and Ethan stood frozen, facing the armed men who had stormed in. The leader, Victor, radiated smug confidence, his polished gear a stark contrast to the scavenged surroundings. Behind him, his men fanned out, their weapons trained on Ethan and Lyra with practiced precision. Ethan's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, shielding Lyra. "You've got no business here, Victor. Leave." Victor chuckled, tapping the side of his pulse rifle lazily. "Oh, but I do, Ethan. You've been busy out here, building things the colony doesn't approve of. Now, normally, I'd let someone like you rot out here, but this..." He gestured toward the exoskeleton Lyra was wearing. "This is a problem." Lyra's fingers gripped the suit's controls, her heart pounding in her chest. The exoskeleton felt sturdy, powerful even, but she wasn't sure how much it could handle. She glanced at Ethan, whose eyes were darting around the room, searching for an opening. "You don't understand what this suit represents," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "It's a chance for people the colony has abandoned to fight back, to survive." Victor smirked. "That's exactly why it's a problem. The colony doesn't need outcasts thinking they can challenge the system. Order relies on people knowing their place." He tilted his head, studying Lyra. "And you. You're a prime example of someone who should have stayed in hers. Lyra felt a surge of anger, her fear giving way to defiance. You don't know anything about me. Victor's smirk faltered, replaced by a glint of annoyance. I know enough. And I know that suit doesn't belong to you. Ethan stepped closer, his fists clenched. Over my dead body. Victor sighed theatrically, raising his pulse rifle. That can be arranged. The first shot rang out like a thunderclap, ricocheting off the metal walls of the workshop. Ethan dove for cover, dragging Lyra behind a workbench as Victor's men opened fire. Sparks flew as bolts of energy struck the equipment, sending shards of metal and glass raining down. Can you fight in that thing? Ethan shouted over the chaos, his back pressed against the bench. I don't know. Lyra replied, panic creeping into her voice. I've barely tested it. Well, now's the time to find out, Ethan said, tossing her a pulse grenade. Use this to clear some space. I'll handle the rest. Lyra caught the grenade awkwardly, her hands trembling. She had never used one before, but the instructions etched onto the side were simple enough. Pulling the pin, she lobbed it toward Victor's men. The explosion was deafening, a shockwave knocking several of them off their feet. Ethan sprang into action, firing his pulse rifle with practiced precision. His shots were deliberate, targeting their weapons and forcing them to scatter. Meanwhile, Lyra struggled to control the exoskeleton, its servos whirring as she moved awkwardly through the chaos. Come on, Lyra, she muttered to herself, gripping the controls tighter. You can do this. Taking a deep breath, she focused on the suit's movements, letting it guide her instead of fighting against it. Slowly, she began to find her rhythm. When one of Victor's men charged toward her, she swung the suit's arm, the metal limb connecting with a resounding crack that sent him flying. Nice hit, Ethan called, grinning despite the chaos. Victor, however, was unfazed. He barked orders to his remaining men, who regrouped and began firing in unison. The workshop's protective walls buckled under the assault, and smoke filled the air, making it harder to see. We can't hold them off forever, Lyra shouted, her voice strained. Then we don't, Ethan replied, pulling a small device from his belt. This will overload the workshop's systems. It'll fry their equipment and buy us time to escape. Lyra's eyes widened. And what about us? Ethan smirked. We run like hell. As the device activated, the lights flickered and sparks erupted from the walls. A high-pitched whine filled the air, growing louder by the second. Victor's men shouted in confusion as their weapons malfunctioned, the electromagnetic pulse scrambling their systems. Now, Ethan yelled, grabbing Lyra's arm. Together, they sprinted toward the exit, the exoskeleton's powerful legs propelling Lyra forward with ease. Behind them, the workshop erupted into chaos as the overload reached its peak. Flames licked at the walls, and the sound of collapsing metal echoed through the air. They emerged into the open air, gasping for breath. The twin suns had set, and the night was lit only by the faint glow of the alien flora. Ethan led Lyra to a nearby ravine, where they crouched low to avoid detection. Did we lose them? Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. For now. But Victor won't give up that easily. Lyra's hands tightened into fists. This is my fault. If I hadn't. Stop, Ethan interrupted, his tone firm. None of this is your fault. Victor and his kind thrive on keeping people like us down. But we've proven we can fight back. That's what scares them. Lyra looked at him, her fear slowly giving way to determination. Then we keep fighting. Ethan smiled, the fire in her eyes rekindling his own resolve. Exactly. As they made their way deeper into the wilderness, Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose growing within her. The exoskeleton wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of defiance, a reminder that she wasn't powerless. And for the first time, she began to believe that they could win. Rise of the Forgotten. The wilderness of Vega 12 was eerily quiet as Ethan and Lyra crouched in the shadow of a massive crystal formation, its bioluminescent glow casting strange patterns on their faces. The night was cold, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of nearby energy deposits. Lyra's exoskeleton hummed softly as she adjusted its settings, the controls feeling more natural in her hands now. "We can't keep running forever," Lyra said, her voice low but steady. The fear that had once gripped her was now replaced by a steely determination. "Victor won't stop until he has this suit, or until we're dead." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You're right. He's too dangerous to ignore. But taking him on directly is suicide. We need to be smart." "Smart isn't enough," Lyra replied. "We need help." Ethan turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "From who? The colony has already abandoned us, and the outcasts out here are barely surviving." "Then we give them something to fight for," Lyra said, standing tall despite the weight of the exoskeleton. "Victor isn't just coming after us. He's a threat to anyone who dares to challenge the colony's control. If we can show the others what this suit can do, what we can do, they'll stand with us." Ethan stared at her for a moment, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You really think we can rally the outcasts?" Lyra met his gaze, her voice firm. "I think we have to try." By dawn, Ethan and Lyra had made contact with a small group of outcasts living in the ruins of an old terraforming station. They were a ragtag bunch, engineers, scavengers, and former colonists who had been cast out for one reason or another. At first, they were skeptical of Lyra's plan, their expressions guarded as they listened to her speak. "I know what you're thinking," Lyra said, her voice echoing through the station's hollow halls. "You've been surviving out here for years, keeping your heads down, hoping the colony would forget about you. But how much longer can you keep running? How many more of us have to suffer because we're not perfect enough for their world?" She gestured to the exoskeleton, its polished metal gleaming in the faint light. "This suit isn't just a tool. It's proof that we're more than what they say we are. Together, we can stand up to Victor and anyone else who tries to take that away from us." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, a grizzled old mechanic stepped forward, his arms crossed. "You're asking us to go up against the colony's enforcers. That's a death sentence." "It's only a death sentence if we fight alone," Lyra replied. "But if we stand together, we can make them see that we're not powerless. We can show them that outcasts aren't disposable." The mechanic studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right, I'm in." One by one, the others agreed, their fear giving way to determination. Ethan watched with quiet pride as Lyra rallied them, her words igniting a spark that had long been extinguished in their hearts. The battle plan was simple but bold. Using the resources of the terraforming station, the outcasts worked tirelessly to fortify their defenses and upgrade their equipment. Lyra led the charge, her exoskeleton allowing her to lift heavy machinery and assist with repairs. Ethan coordinated their efforts, his experience as a scavenger proving invaluable. As the hours passed, the group began to transform from a band of survivors into a unified force. They shared stories of their pasts, their voices filled with anger and hope. For the first time in years, they felt like they had a purpose. By nightfall, the trap was set. Victor arrived at the station with a squad of heavily armed enforcers, their vehicles cutting through the wilderness like predators stalking their prey. He stepped out of his transport, his smirk as confident as ever. "Ethan," he called, his voice echoing across the ruins. "You've made this far more complicated than it needed to be. Hand over the suit, and I'll consider letting you live." Lyra stepped forward, the exoskeleton's servos whirring as she moved. The outcasts watched from the shadows, their weapons at the ready. "Not a chance," she said, her voice steady. "You want this suit. Come and take it." Victor's smirk faltered for a moment before he signaled to his men. "So be it." The first shot rang out, and chaos erupted. Lyra moved like a force of nature, the exoskeleton amplifying her strength and speed. She charged through the battlefield, deflecting enemy fire with the suit's reinforced plating. The outcasts emerged from their hiding spots, their weapons blazing as they fought with a fury born of desperation. Ethan used the chaos to his advantage, setting off a series of improvised explosives that disabled Victor's vehicles. The enforcers, caught off guard, struggled to regroup. Victor, however, remained calm. He pulled out a sleek, high-powered weapon and took aim at Lyra. "You think you're a hero," he sneered. "You're nothing but a cripple playing dress-up." Lyra turned to face him, her eyes blazing with determination. "And you're nothing but a coward hiding behind a gun." Victor fired, but Lyra dodged with surprising agility, closing the distance between them in seconds. She grabbed his weapon and crushed it with the exoskeleton's mechanical hand, the metal crumpling like paper. Victor stumbled backward, his confidence finally cracking. "You can't stop the colony," he spat. "You're just one girl." Lyra smiled, her voice ringing with defiance. "I'm not alone." At her signal, the outcasts surged forward, overwhelming the remaining enforcers. Victor's men surrendered one by one, their will to fight broken. When the dust settled, the outcasts stood victorious. The ruins of the station were battered, but their spirits were unshaken. Lyra removed the exoskeleton's helmet, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, but glowing with triumph. Ethan approached her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it." "We did it," Lyra corrected, looking around at the group that had come together to fight for their freedom. For the first time in her life, she felt truly unstoppable. The outcasts had proven that they were more than just survivors. They were a force to be reckoned with, a family bound by their shared defiance. And with Lyra leading the charge, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the first light of dawn broke over Vega 12, Lyra stood tall, the exoskeleton gleaming in the sunlight. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she was ready to change the world.